Welcome to part 2 of week 2, Embodied Histories, Performance, and Reenactment. So we previously discussed Bill Nichols's various modes, the various modes that Nichols identifies in the documentary, as well as his concept of the phantasmatic, and all of these in relationship to Errol Morris's 1988 film, The Thin Blue Line, which really was a watershed film for the reemergence of reenactment as a viable aesthetic strategy in the contemporary documentary after the hegemony, as it were, of the observational cinema verite style throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Joshua Oppenheimer's film The Act of Killing made international waves upon its release in 2012, shocking audiences around the world for both the heartbreaking and infuriating story it told about the little-known, in the West, Indonesian genocide of 1965, as well as for its audacious use of performance and reenactment as a method of accessing the trauma and guilt of history. Here is how Errol Morris describes the film in his article, The Murders of Gonzago, an article whose title refers to the play within the play in Shakespeare's Hamlet, in which Hamlet stages a scenario to help reveal the motives and actions behind the murder of his father, the King of Denmark. Morris. Josh Oppenheimer's film The Act of Killing, for which I served, along with Werner Herzog, as an executive producer, is an examination of the Indonesian mass killings of 1965-66, in which between 500,000 and 1 million people died. The Act of Killing is truly unlike any other documentary film, a good thing in my opinion. One of the extraordinary things about documentary film is that you get to continually reinvent the form, reinvent what it means to make a documentary, and Oppenheimer did just that. He identified several of the killers from 1965 and convinced them to make a movie about the killings. But the film is even weirder than that. Oppenheimer convinced these killers to act in a movie about the making of a movie about the killings. There would be reenactments of the murders by the actual perpetrators. There would be singing, and there would be dancing, a perverted hall of mirrors. As Bill Nichols has observed of The Act of Killing elsewhere, quote, the filmmaker allows the perpetrators of terrible crimes the opportunity to represent themselves as they wish in lurid reenactments of their torture and execution tactics. Their consciousness does not appear to embrace the idea of guilt. The viewer boggles at their rationalizations, their tunnel vision, their amorality. Reenactments, which had faded from the scene in the 1960s, return in compellingly innovative forms, carrying the innovative departures noted in The Thin Blue Line to new heights. So where The Thin Blue Line depicted the historical injustice that put an innocent man onto death row, in The Act of Killing, we have the far greater magnitudes of genocide playing themselves out. So in the previous half of this lecture, I discussed Nichols's concept of going through the motions related to this, the phantasmatic dimensions of reenactment. And so we can start to think about how if history is written by the winners, so the cliche tells us, we start to ask about what about how the so-called winners recall their past deeds, the actions that made them winners, and thus provide the foundations for and connections between the past and the present. What about when those who won are the murderers, when public space is entirely dominated by fear and the fantasies and boasting of the victorious killers, when public discourse and official memory is so one-sided and corrupt that the perpetrators of horrific crimes against humanity are folk heroes, so-called free men, gangsters, inspired by action movies and American westerns, living legends in their own time, and the victims, who have no recourse because the regime that perpetrated the crimes is still in power and still perpetuating its narrative, its fantasies surrounding the events of the past. And so if we turn to Nichols and we reconsider how reenactment is an engagement with the signifier which itself generates a pleasure that is at the same time corporeal, which is to say bodily, a going through the motions, as well as psychic, mental, emotional, imaginative. We start to wonder about how the two are entwined in the story of a nation. This is Nichols writing about the phantasmatic aspects of reenactment. Pleasure flows from an act of imaginary engagement in which the subject knows that this act stands for a prior act or event with which it is not one, a separation that entails a shift from physical needs and their pacification to psychical desires and their gratification, from before to after, from then to now, from object to subject, is as integral to the phantasmatic experience as it is to the efficacy of ideology. In a dialogue with Errol Morris, Joshua Oppenheimer has explained his turn to performance and reenactment as a means of interaction, of bringing out the fantasy life that informs and sustains the traumas of social and historical experience. In this way, Oppenheimer has said that in his films he is less interested in narrative or providing information, these things can be communicated in other ways, than he is in his cinema in searching for symptoms, uncovering what he calls imminent metaphors in the bodies and gestures of the living, in this case, the living executioners, thus making the invisible visible. Here's Oppenheimer, quote, "Here's a film where we go into the way that imagination, storytelling, fantasy play into evil acts, what it means to do something that's devastating, not just to the people whom you're hurting and their families, but also to yourself. You have to be acting in a blind spot of self-ignorance in the moment, a kind of blindness. Anwar is talking about the way he used movies, not just to get clever methods of killing, but to step out of himself, as he says, coming out of an Elvis movie in a state of trance-like enchantment with the music and the fun of it, all so he could kill happily." Now I want to briefly consider this question of the phantasmatic, this question of imagination and fantasy, these deeds that are done with great pleasure and this public boasting to what we might consider to be the corruption of public discourse in the current regime, under the current regime in Indonesia. So if in The Thin Blue Line, Errol Morris uses reenactment to illustrate lies in a kind of ironic aesthetic system of competing and debunking many images and stories, the narratives attached to them, in order to access, but not to show, the truth, the innocence of Randall Adams, then Oppenheimer, in The Act of Killing, takes us into the ideological and fantasy structures, lives and repressions and negations that are enacted publicly of killers. The film is about fantasy, and reenactment is a way of accessing fantasy in relation to historical acts and events, themselves ideological and structured by fantasy. As Janet Walker points out in her essay, Referred Pain, The Act of Killing, and the Production of a Crime Scene, The Act of Killing is also about space, political and psychic, public and interpersonal, dominated by a monopoly of violence, a grand narrative with its own aberrations as well, its free men, its exceptional killings, and so on, that excludes and represses alternative narratives and meanings, the stories and experiences of the relatives of victims of the massacres. The city, the countryside, the nation is a giant crime scene. As Walker further argues, this crime scene is constructed within and emerges from a process of perpetrators' reenactments of crimes in and nearby the sites of those historical crimes. And so reenactment is a part of a process of establishing and constructing a crime scene. And we remember that The Thin Blue Line is about reenacting, which is to say, producing and deconstructing, refracting and multiplying the fantasies surrounding and constituting the narrative of a crime scene. Now next week, we'll see how Videograms of a Revolution by Harun Farokhi and Andrei Ujica also documents a kind of transformation of social and symbolic space, in this case through a revolution as captured and communicated through a multitude of images in the present. Finally, I want us to consider the thoughts on the act of killing through the lens of the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who has also written insightfully on the film. Now, both The Thin Blue Line and the act of killing, as we've noted, are interested in delusion, illusion, collective guilt or lack thereof, crime, etc., and the stories told around and reperformed to maintain and sustain a collective identity and ongoing crime lived into the present in everyday life. And in this way, they are films as much about subjectivity and point of view as they are about history and event. They are films about ideology, about internal states connected to the story of a nation. Now, Slavoj Žižek, in a 2013 article, has said, quote, "What kind of society publicly celebrates a monstrous orgy of torture and killing decades after it took place, not by justifying it as an extraordinary, necessary crime for the public good, but as an ordinary, acceptable, pleasurable activity? The trap to be avoided here is the easy one of putting the blame on either Hollywood or on the ethical primitiveness of Indonesia. The starting point should rather be the dislocating effects of capitalist globalization, which, by undermining what he calls the symbolic efficacy of traditional ethical structures, creates such a moral vacuum," unquote. And so we want to think about how this decline of public space, a space where there might be a possibility of sharing stories of alternative visions and alternative experiences, such as those of the victims, where in this absence, reconciliation is impossible. Here's Žižek. He goes on, quote, "It is often said that today, with our exposure to the media, our culture of public confessions and instruments, of digital control, private space is disappearing. One should counter this. It is the public space proper that is disappearing. The person who displays on the web his or her naked images or intimate data is not an exhibitionist. Exhibitionists intrude into the public space, while those who post their naked images on the web remain in their private space and are just expanding it to include others. The same goes for Anwar and his colleagues in the act of killing. They are privatizing the public space in a sense that is far more threatening than economic privatization." So we can think about how what Žižek is calling this privatization of public space is the effect of and continues to perpetuate this moral, ethical, political vacuum. And we could begin to also think about how Oppenheimer's use of reenactments is a way of demonstrating this corruption of public space in having the perpetrators so brazenly relive and boast about their crimes. Now, on that tip, I want to mention that while the act of killing focuses on the perpetrators, we should also consider Oppenheimer's film that was released in 2014, 2 years after the act of killing, a film entitled The Look of Silence, in which the surviving family members of victims of the massacres confront their killers. Now, of course, this is a very dangerous scenario because the regime that came into power with those massacres was still in power at the time of the making of The Look of Silence. So this is another fraught ethical space in which encounter takes place. So finally, I would like to just turn to 4 questions or topics of discussion that we can consider in our online discussion on Canvas or in our synchronous discussion in Microsoft Teams on Friday. So I will quickly go through these questions. The first pertains to Nichols's 5 modes of reenactment, those being, again, realist dramatization, typification, Brechtian distanciation, stylization, and parody and irony. And we can ask which of these modes are operative in the act of killing. Furthermore, what are the representational, ethical, or political consequences of Oppenheimer's use of these different modes of reenactment in the film? And how do these reenactments produce a sense of history in and for the present? My second topic builds on Nichols's discussion in Documentary Reenactment and the Phantasmatic Subject, in which he describes the phantasmatic in terms of how it, quote, resurrects a sense of a previous moment that is now seen through a fold that incorporates the embodied perspective of the filmmaker and the emotional investment of the viewer. In this way, reenactments effect a temporal vivification in which past and present coexist in the impossible space of a phantasmatic. This form of coexistence revolves around a lost object and the signifiers that serve as resurrected ghosts that both haunt and endow the present with psychic intensity. Reenactments, like other poetic and rhetorical tropes, bring desire itself into being, and with it, the phantasmatic domain, wherein the temporality of lived experience and the efficacy of ideology find embodiment. So what I would like for us to do, perhaps, is to unpack this rather dense passage and think about its relevance to understanding the phantasmatic dimensions of the film, and explain them. How we can perhaps think about how fantasy informs the very sense of reality of these historical executioners, these historical winners. Question 3. In a later scene in the act of killing, we see Anwar Congo and his grandsons review the reenacted dramatizations of interrogation, torture, and murder that he perpetrated in 1965-66. Right? So these scenes that occur later in the film in Anwar's home, when he sits with his grandson, looking on a small television monitor at the footage of these sequences shot in a studio where Anwar and others perform as both the perpetrators of crimes, the interrogators and torturers and murderers, but they also perform as the victims. And Anwar himself is made up, of course, in makeup and performs in both roles. And this also generates different effects for him in the realm of his sense of fantasy, as well as his own perhaps guilt and culpability. And so what is the significance of this scene or others like it in terms of the sharing of real national and intergenerational trauma, guilt, and or knowledge thereof? Now finally, landscape and location is a significant aspect of the act of killing. Consider, for example, the waterfall scene in the film. What is the significance of this scene in a documentary film about genocide and personal and historical trauma and guilt? As Janet Walker puts it in her essay Referred Pain, quote, how does the act of killing combine places and persons to sense, map, trouble, transmit, and in fact to constitute the geography of atrocity it might seem only to revisit and recreate? So again, I look forward to discussing these questions with you, both in our synchronous and asynchronous formats. Thank you.